The Lost Apothecary by Sarah Pinner, told from the view of Nella and Eliza, Part 5. It was after 8 o'clock in the evening, and though Nella had worked ceaselessly over the last few hours, she would not let me help. Instead, she strained under the effort of pushing corks as far into their bottles as they would go, nesting the empty boxes as tightly as they would fit, and scrubbing a few galley pots with all her might. She tidied and organized as though she meant to leave, if not permanently, then at least for a long while, and it was due entirely to my careless mistake. Of all the errors, great and small, I have made in my 12 years of life, I believe that taking the jar from the lower cabinet was my greatest offense of all. How could I have overlooked the address etched into the jar? I'd never before made such a mess of things, never in my life. Oh, how I wished I could turn back the hours, and to think I was once merely useless to Nella. At present, that seemed a dream. With all my mistake, I might have doomed her and all of us within the pages of her book. I thought again of the many names I've traced in the register a couple of days ago. I had darkened the ink strokes in order to prevent and protect the names of the women, to give them a place in history, just as Nella had explained. Now I feared I hadn't preserved and protected anything at all. Instead, my mistake with the canister might expose the countless women in this book, might ruin them all. I considered any practical way to repair my wrongdoing, but could think of none. Only the reverse of time could fix this, but it seemed a daunting thing to ask, even of magic. And yet Nella had not sent me away. Did she mean to kill me? Force me to account for my mistake? The room in which we sat, not speaking to one another, was thick with her frustration. I aimed to be as quiet as possible, so not to further agitate her, and shrank in shame near the faded cupboard, hunched over myself, only 3 things before me: the book of household magic from Tom Pepper lying open in my lap, the book of midwives' magic from Nella set aside, and a candle that was nearly spent. I had not the heart to ask Nella for a new candle, and would be forced soon to put away the books and, fall asleep with my head against the stone wall, wait for Nella to issue her punishment? I lifted the dying candle above the open pages before me. In the dim light, the printed words of Tom Pepper's magic book seemed to dance and move on the page, and it took great effort for me to focus on a single line of text. This frustrated me greatly. If there was ever a time to rely on magic, what with its ability to give breath to stillborn baby Tom, it was now. I needed to find a spell to fix it all, and it couldn't happen a moment too soon. Whereas this afternoon I sought a potion to undo me of a man's spirit, and now I wished to remove the burden I had unwittingly placed upon Nella and myself and many others, the threat of arrest, condemnation, and perhaps even execution. With my finger, I traced each sentence and continued to run through the list of spells within Tom's book. Oil of transparency, effervescence for extended spring crop, tincture to remove bad fortune. Amid the clamor of Nella's hammering a nail into a wooden crate, my eyes widened. Tincture to remove bad fortune. Well, I could be sure that no good fortune had found me whatsoever in the recent days. My hand began to shake, the flame of the candle with it, as I read the spell, which claimed to be more powerful than any weapon, any court, any king. I studied the required ingredients: venom and rosewater, crushed feather and fern root, among others. As I swallowed hard, growing feverish, they were strange things, yes, but Nella's shop was full of strange things, and I already had 2 of them, the rosewater, and fernroot were on her shelves. But what about the others? There was no way to move about the shop unnoticed. How could I collect the things I needed, much less prepare them, as indicated in the book? I would need to reveal the plans to Nella, for there was no other way. At once there came another striking noise. I had believed it a moment ago to be Nella's hammer, but now I saw she had set the hammer down. As understanding came over me, I nearly dropped the candle. Someone was at the door. Nella, toiling by the hearth, looked at the door, her manner calm. She gave no sense of fear, showed no nerves. Did she wish it to be the authorities? Perhaps an end to all this would be a welcome relief. Meanwhile, I remained frozen in terror. If a constable had come to arrest Nella, what would become of me? Would Nella reveal what I had done to Mr. Amwell? I would never see my mother or my mistress again, never get the chance to tell Tom Pepper of the spell I meant to try. Or what if the newcomer was something even worse? The thought of Mr. Amwell's hollow eyes and the idea of his milky, hazy ghost seized me, clutched my very heart. Perhaps he grew tired of waiting and had returned for me at last. "Nella, wait," I cried. She ignored me, with no hesitation in her step. Nella approached the door and opened it. I tensed, setting Tom Pepper's magic book aside, and leaned forward to better see around the door. There was only one person in the shadows. I sighed in relief, for surely a constable would not arrive without his partner. The visitor, covered in loose black fabric, wore a hood over their face. Their shoes were caked in mud. The stench hit me instantly, horse urine and turned over earth. And from where I sat across the room, the guest appeared little more than a shrouded, trembling shadow. A pair of black-gloved hands extended forward. Held between them was a jar, the jar I had filled only yesterday with the deadly beetle powder. It took me a moment to fully comprehend what was happening before me. The jar, Nella's death sentence, was no more. The visitor unwrapped the black fabric around their face, and I gasped in recognition. It was Lady Clarence. Oh, I had never been so relieved to see anyone in all my life. Nella reached a hand to the wall to steady herself. "You have the jar," she said, her voice hardly more than a whisper. Oh, how I feared this would not be the case. She leaned forward, her other hand on her chest, and I worried she might fall to her knees. I stood at once and moved towards her. "I came as quickly as I could," Lady Clarence told us. A hairpin hung loose against her neck, ready to dislodge at any moment. You must understand the flurry of activity at the estate. I have never seen so many people in my life. It is as if another dinner party is imminent, though a more somber one at that. And the questions they continued to ask, the attorneys worst of all. The activity was too much for my lady's maid. She left me. This morning before dawn I rose. Off she went without a word. Told only the coachman that she had resigned and planned to leave the city. I suppose I can't blame her, given recent events. She did play a part in the whole thing, putting the powder into Miss Beckwell's glass, though she has left me greatly inconvenienced. "Heavens," Nella said, but in her voice I heard apathy. She did not care a whit about Lady Clarence's lady-maid, or lack therefore. She reached for the jar and spun it around in her hand and let out a sigh. "This is the one, yes. This is the exact one. Oh, how you've saved me from ruin, Lady Clarence. Yes, yes, well, I told you I would dispose of it, and returning it to you here has been quite a chore. But your look this afternoon gave me such a fright. All is well now, I trust, and I see little reason to stay even for a second longer than necessary, as it is growing late, and I've not had a moment for a proper cry." Nella offered her tea before she took leave. but Lady Clarence declined. "One more thing," she said, briefly glancing at me, and then trailing her eyes across the tiny room, void of the luxuries with which she must have been accustomed. "I am not entirely sure what arrangements you've given the girl, but in the event you'd consider it, please do keep in mind that I am now seeking a new housemaid." She motioned to me like I was a piece of furniture. "She's younger than I'd preferred, but not unreasonably so, and she'd be obedient enough, the type to keep her mouth closed, yes? I'd like to fill the vacancy by the end of the week. Please do let me know as soon as possible. As I said, I'm on Carter Lane." Nella stammered over her reply. "Thank you for letting me know," she said. "Eliza and I will discuss this. Such a change may be a welcome idea." Lady Clarence nodded and made her way out, leaving Nella and me alone. Nella set the jar on the table, sank into the chair, the necessity of her organizing and packing efforts now removed. I glanced to Tom's magic book. Still on the floor, the candle beside it had expired at last. "Well," Nella began, "there is no immediate crisis now. You may stay here tonight on account of this fortunate event. In the morning I do suggest you do consider the idea of visiting Lady Clarence. It may be a good post for you, should you remain fearful of the Amwell house." The Amwell house. The very words reminded me that not every curse upon me had vanished with the return of the jar. My era that put Nella at risk might be gone, but that left me in the same spot I'd been in earlier today, and I had no desire for a post with Lady Clarence. I did not trust her, and her manner was cold. I desired only to return to the service of my mistress. This meant returning to the Amwell house, so the importance of the tincture to reverse bad fortune still existed. Of the hundreds of spells I had read in that book, it was the only one, with a bit of imagination, seemed to be able to vanquish Mr. Amwell's lingering spirit. Grateful for a place to lay my head, my heart now thumped in hopeful anticipation about the tincture. But if I intended to attempt the spell, then I must either tell Nella of my plans in the hope that she would permit me to use her vials, or I must think of a way to gather the ingredients without her knowing, like Frederick did so very long ago. Yet, if I even chose the first option, this exact moment did not seem like the wisest. We were both tired, Nella so much so that her eyes were pink. For now we both needed a few hours of sleep. Tomorrow would come soon enough, and then I would find a way to try my hand at this thing they call magic. I tucked the book beneath my head and used it as a makeshift pillow, and I fell asleep. I could not help but fall asleep into an easy dream of the boy who had given it to me. Nella, February 11th, 1791. If the poison I dispensed, and the deaths they subsequently caused, were indeed rotting me from the inside, then I felt sure that the death of Lord Clarence hastened the decay. Was it possible the consequence upon me increased with the renown of the victim? It was only of some significance that Lady Clarence returned the damnable jar, for the immediate crisis of the gallows was averted, but the slow rotting within me did not cease. A thick bloody trickle in my throat had plagued me, and while I would have liked to blame it on the late nights in the beetle field, I feared something worse, that whatever plagued me in my bones and skull had moved into my lungs. Oh, how I cursed the day that Lady Clarence dropped her rose-scented letter in the barley bin, and how maddening that none of my own concoctions would resolve this. I hadn't the name of the disease, much less the remedy for it. I could not sit in my shop another moment, turning the stone, and I needed a block of lard besides. And although I had not the heart to send Eliza away immediately after Mrs. Clarence's visit, I had no choice. As I prepared to depart for the market, I told Eliza once and for all it was time for her to leave. She asked me how long I planned to be gone. No more than an hour, I said, and she begged for me to let her rest another 30 minutes, claiming a deep ache in her head on account of yesterday's anxieties. Admittedly, I suffered a bad headache myself, and so I gave her an oil of herb prunella to rub on her temples, and told her to rest her eyes just a few minutes more. We said our goodbyes, and she assured me she would be gone by the time I returned. I gathered my tendrils of strength and made my way to Fleet Street. I kept my head down, fearing as always that someone might look in my eyes and discern the secret I kept within, every murder as clear as crystal glass from which Lord Clarence drank to his death. But no one paid me any mind. Along the avenue a woman offered lemon confections, and an artist sketched light-hearted caricatures. The sun began to peek out of the clouds. Its heat wrapped around my tired, sore neck, and around me floated the safe, relaxed din of conversation. No one seemed interested in me. No one ever noticed me. I could not help, therefore, but think it's a good day, or at least better than yesterday. As I passed a newspaper stand, I found myself tangled up with a small boy and his mother. She had just bought a newspaper, and now attempted to wrestle him back into his coat as he ran in circles around her, making a game of it. Since my head was down, I could not properly see, much less avoid the chaos, and I found myself stepping right into the little boy's path. "Oh!" I exclaimed. My market bag flew forward and gave the boy a good knock in the head. Behind him, his mother lifted the newspaper and gave him a firm smack on the bottom. Under attack from 2 women, including one stranger, the young boy relented. "Fine, Mama," he said, and stuck his arms out like a featherless bird, waiting for his coat. The woman victoriously handed the newspaper to the person nearest her, which happened to be me. Yesterday's evening newspaper headline, "The Thursday Bulletin," fell open in my hand. It was thin, unlike the stacks of the Chronicle or the Post, and glanced down at it with disinterest, expecting to return it to the woman as soon as she had a free hand. But an insert, a hastily printed advertisement, had been stuffed within, and my eyes caught silver words towards the bottom. Like black inky beasts, the words read, "Bailiff searching for Lord Clarence's murderer." I froze, rereading the words, covering my mouth, lest I wrench onto the clean pages. My nervous state must be playing tricks on me. Lady Clarence had returned the jar, and all was well. Certainly no one was suspected of murder. Why must I have misread the text? I forced myself to pull my eyes off the page and look at something new. The purple ribbon, adorned hat sitting atop a lady across the street, or the blinding glimmer of sunshine on the windows behind her. And then I returned my gaze to the page. The words had not changed. "Miss?" came a soft voice. "Miss?" I looked up to see the mother, holding the hand of her now obedient son, wearing his thick coat, waiting for me to return the paper to her. Yes, I stammered. "Yes, here you are." I handed it over, the paper trembling as it passed from my fingers to hers. She thanked me and stepped away, after which I rushed immediately to the newsboy at the stand. "The Thursday Bulletin," I said. "You have a copy?" "A few." He gave me one of 2 remaining copies on his table. I dropped in a coin, shoved the paper into my bag, and rushed away from him, lest the terror on my face betray me. But as I fled to Ludgate Bridge, forcing one foot in front of the other, with as much speed as I could muster, I finally began to fear the worst. What if the authorities were already at my shop right this moment? Little Eliza was there alone. I slid between two rubbish bins at the side of the building, opening the paper, and read it quickly as I could. It was printed overnight. The ink was still fresh. At first I found the article so impossible to believe. I wondered if I'd been given a prop in some performance, one of which I acted the unwitting performer, and perhaps I could have been convicted. It was mere theatrics, and the detail did not tie together so well. The lady's maid, I learned, did abruptly resign from her post, just as Lady Clarence said, but she must have put two and two together about Lord Clarence's death, for she went straight to the authorities with wax impressions of my mother's engraved jar. I nearly cried out. It was of no consequence that the jar now rested safely in my shop, for the maid took the damned impression of it. She must have done it before Lady Clarence seized the canister from the cellar. Perhaps the maid was fearful of taking the jar itself on account of being found out and labeled a thief. According to the article, the wax impression revealed a partially legible set of letters, B-L-E-Y, and a single thumbprint, size drawing, which appeared to authorities to be a bear on all fours. Lady Clarence's maid told authorities that her mistress, Lady Clarence, instructed her to put the contents of the canister in the dessert liqueur that was ultimately ingested by Lord Clarence. The maid presumed it was a sweetener, only later did she realize it was poison. I continued reading and clasped my hand over my throat. The authorities went to Lady Clarence's home late last evening. It must have been soon after she had returned the jar, which would explain the hours-old ink and the hastily printed insert. But Lady Clarence denied the maid's claim, insisting no knowledge of any poison or canister whatsoever. Upon turning the page, I learned that the identification of the origin of the poison was now of some utmost importance. At this point, I let out another small cry. Might serve to resolve the conflicting stories of Lady Clarence and her maid. The bailiff hoped that in exchange for a reasonable amount of clemency, the dispenser would identify who actually purchased the poison that was used to kill Lord Clarence. And yet, the utter peculiarity of it, Lord Clarence was not meant to suffer a sure and sudden death at all. Miss Birkwell was the one meant to drink the Catharites, and yet she escaped the entire thing unscathed. She was not so much as a suspect in her lover's death, her name not even mentioned in the article. I had mourned the possibility of her death all along, but by God now things had swung in her favor. At the end was a crude image, a hand-drawn copy of the wax impression, provided by the lady's maid. If the canister itself was hardly legible, this drawing of it certainly wasn't any better. That, if nothing else, gave me a moment of ease. I tore my eyes from the page. My damp, hot fingers had smudged the ink in several places, and the flesh of my inner arms and groin was damp. I stood in the narrow alley between two bins of rubbish, breathing deep, sucking in the odor of decay. As I saw it, there were two possibilities. I could return to the shop and blow out every candle, lest the authorities locate 3 Back Alley, and I must rely on my final disguise, the cupboard wall, to protect me and the secrets housed within. But even it didn't protect me, for how long would I last under the relentless grasp of my illness? Only days, I feared, and oh, how I did not want to die while trapped inside my mother's shop. I had spoiled it enough. Need I ruin it any further with the decay of my body? The second possibility, of course, was that the cupboard wall might not protect me. As safe as I've felt behind it for years, my shop's address has never been exposed in such a blatant way. The disguise was not infallible. The authorities might arrive with hounds at their heels, and the dogs would surely smell my scent of fear through the walls. If the authorities broke their way through and arrested me, what legacy was left to preserve from my prison? The lingering trace of my mother was delicate enough. Memories of her came easily as I moved about my shop, but these precious recollections would not follow me to Newgate. That wasn't to say I would find myself alone. I expected the constables would soon bring in the countless other women whose names were in the register. Women I intended to aid, to comfort, would then be alongside me behind the iron bars, and we would be accompanied by the unwanted groping of the prison guards. No, I refuse it. I refuse both possibilities because there was one more option. This third and final choice was to lock up the shop, leave the register safely behind the false wall, and hasten my own death, to dive into the icy depths of the River Thames, to make myself one with the shadows of the Blackfriar Bridge. I had thought of it many times, most recently while crossing the river with the baby Beatrice in my arms, as I gazed at the waves lapping against the creamy white stone pillars and felt the firm mist on my nose. Had all my life led me to this destiny, that fateful moment when the cold water would braid around me and pull me under? But the child, Eliza, was at the shop, just where I had left her, and I could not leave her alone to suffer the inquisition of a bailiff that might find his way back to Three Back Alley. What if Eliza heard a commotion, peeked out the door, and unwittingly exposed what lay behind the false walls? She made one grave mistake already. If she made another and found herself facing an angry constable, I could not ask the poor child to defend all that I've done. It had already been 15 minutes since I left her. Stuffing the newspaper back into my bag, I stepped out of the alley to return to my shop of potions. I could not choose a certain death, not yet anyhow. I had to go back for her. I had to go back for little Eliza. I heard her before I saw her. A fury rose inside me. Her careless noise-making could have ruined us, if the drawing in the newspaper didn't do it for us first. "Eliza," I hissed, closing the cupboard door behind me, "I can hear your clatter from halfway across the city. Have you no—" But my breath caught at the scene before me. At the table in the center of the room, Eliza sat before enormous jars, bottles, and crushed leaves of all colors, sorted into separate bowls. These must have been 24 vessels in all. She looked up at me, pestle in hand, and a look of concentration frozen on her brow. Her cheek was smeared with reddish pigment, merely beet powder, I pray, and the strands of her hair above her forehead jutted out in all directions as though she'd been boiling water over the fire. For a moment I was returned to the same scene 30 years ago, but it was me at the table, and my mother stood above me, her eyes patient, if not a bit vexed. The memory only lasted an instant. "What is all this?" I asked, fearing that the crushed leaves that littered the floor, the table, and my instruments might be deadly. If so, the cleanup of such might be dreadful. I'm working on some hot brews," she stammered. "Remember the first time I visited? You gave me it was called Valeria, I think? Here, I found some." She pulled a dark reddish jar towards me. Instinctively, I glanced at the third shelf from the bottom of the way back. The back wall. The spot where the valerium should be was indeed empty. And here, too, rosewater and peppermint. She thrust the vials forward. Where to begin with this ignorant child? Had she no sense? "Eliza, don't touch another thing. How on earth do you know that none of these may kill you?" I rushed to the table, my eyes scanning each jar. "You're to tell me that you began pulling things from my shelves without any knowledge of what they may do to you? Oh heavens, which ones have you tasted?" Panic rose inside of me as I began to consider antidotes to most of my most lethal poisons. cures that could be quickly blended and administered. "I have been listening very closely in the recent days," she said. I frowned, not believing I had any recent need for things such as rosewater and venom and firmroot, the last of which was clearly marked on the wooden box balancing precariously at the edge of the table. "And I also re-referenced a couple of your books over there." She pointed at the books, but they appeared untouched, meaning that Eliza was either lying about it or she had the touch of a well-practiced thief. "I've prepared a couple of the teas here for us to try." She bravely pushed 2 cups forward, one of them brimming with liquid of a deep indigo color, and the other in a pale brown resembling the inside of a chamber pot. "Before I leave for good," she added, her voice trembling. I had no interest in her hot brews, and I had a mind to tell her as much, but I reminded myself that Eliza hadn't read the news article that left me with such taut nerves. Now more than ever I needed to remain diligent and discreet, and it would be prudent to resume tidying up the shop once and for all. Though I had no aim to return, I could not bear to leave it disheveled. "Listen very closely to me, girl." I set down the market bag, emptying except the newspaper. "You must leave right now, without a moment to waste." I set down the market bag, empty except for the newspaper. Her hand fell onto a pile of crushed leaves on the table. Defeated and heartbroken, she seemed in that moment more of a child than I'd ever known her to be. She glanced at the cupboard where the canister stood, the one that Lady Clarence had returned to us. How confused Eliza must have been by my forcefulness and the sudden necessity to make haste. Still, I would not tell her my reasoning. I would not tell her what I knew. I meant even then to protect her. I tilted my head, pitying the both of us. I wish I could send her to Lady Clarence's, but knowing that the authorities were there, asking questions, it was much too close for my comfort. "Please go back to the Elmwell house, child. I know you fear it so, but you must go. It will be safe, I promise." Surrounded by the crushed leaves and the colorful spills, Eliza gazed at the jars and the bottles in front of her as she considered my request. At last she nodded and said, "I will go." Then she wrapped her fingers around something I could not see and stuffed it into her dress. I did not care enough to question her about it. Let the child take whatever she wants. Greater concerns await me. After all, our very lives were at stake. Nella, February 11th, 1791. Nella was meant to be gone for an hour, and I was horrified when she returned in less than half that. It was time enough to find the blend for the ingredients needed for the tincture to reverse bad fortune, but not enough to tidy my mess and replace the vials to the shelves. Once inside, she found me filthy-handed with 2 hot brews, which served only to disguise, just as she taught me, something to show her in the event she returned early, because I did not want her to know I had used her vials for magic. The hot brews were meant to deceive her, and so I couldn't help but feel somewhat like Frederick, who had also blended tinctures behind Nella's back. But whereas he meant to use them against her, I meant her no harm. Something seemed to worry Nella, and despite the mess upon which she'd stumbled, she was not angry with me, as I would have expected. Breathless, she stated that I must leave at once and begged me return to the Amwell house. No matter, most of my work was complete, just moments before she stepped inside. I poured the newly mixture potion into 2 vials, both of which I found sitting out with the other empty containers on the surface of her main workplace. I thought it prudent to prepare 2 vials in case one slipped and shattered. Only 4 inches high or so, the vials were identical, all but only color. One was the color of the soft daylight, a pale translucent blue, and the other a pastel rose-colored pink. I had been sure to check twice, 3 times. The vials were etched only with the image of the bear, no words. The vials were now tucked inside my dress against my chest. Nella seemed relieved when I agreed to comply with her wishes and leave the shop, but I did not intend to return immediately to the Amwa house, as she believed. According to the magic book, the tincture must be cured for 66 minutes, and I finished the blending only 4 minutes ago, at exactly 1 o'clock. For this reason, I could not go to the Amwa house, not yet. I offered to clean up the mess I'd made, but she shook her head, calling it a worthless task as things stood now. Though I wasn't sure what she meant by this, I placed my hand over my chest, where the vials were now secured. Soon I hoped things would return to normal. In only weeks, my mistress would return to Norwich, and we could resume our long, comfortable days together in her drawing room, free of Mr. Amwell altogether, in any form. And so for the second time in 2 days, Nella and I parted ways. There was no doubt in my mind that today I would not see her again. She did not want me there, and whether the magic tincture worked or not, it would be unwise to return. Despite this goodbye with my newfound friend, my heart felt light, and the vials were cold against my skin and full of possibilities, and I was not sad as the last time we said goodbye. I did not cry, and even Nella seemed distracted, like her heart was not raw. As we hugged the final time, I checked the clock behind her. 8 minutes had passed. I stuffed Tom Pepper's magic book into the inner pocket of my gown. Although the tincture was now mixed, and I had no need of the book, I could not bear to part with his gift, and I meant some day, very soon, to return to his shop. Perhaps we could open the book and try to find another spell or 2 together. The idea of it made the tip of my fingers tingle. Though I could not return to the Amwa house with my tincture for another hour, I headed west because the route to the Amwells took me closer to another place I was curious to see, the Clarence estate. While I had little interest in accepting Lady Clarence's vacancy, my curiosity was piqued by the unseen place where Lord Clarence met his end. I walked towards the breathtaking dome of St. Paul's, eventually turning onto Carter Lane, where Lady Clarence had said she lived. Before me lay a half-dozen terrace homes, identical in appearance, and on any other day I would have no idea which one belonged to the Clarence family. But that was not the case today. The house was at the far end, like a honeypot of bees, swarmed with people, and the buzz of uneasy conversation floated all about. I knew instinctively that this was the Clarence home, and something was awry. I stiffened, afraid to move closer. Standing behind a row of hedges, I observed the scene. Indeed, there must have been more than 20 people running about, half of them constables in dark blue tailcoats. I did not see Lady Clarence anywhere. I shook my head, not understanding for the reason of such excitement. I had seen last night the jar that Lady Clarence returned to Nella. She had given no hint of a crisis, and her greatest concern at the moment was that her lady's maid had left abruptly. If she had been suspected of a crime, she would have mentioned it last night. Had something else happened at the house? My courage built, and an idea struck me at once. I would approach the house, pretend to be interested in Lady Clarence's vacancy, and perhaps learn the reason for so many visitors, so many constables. I stepped away from the shrub and walked casually towards the house, like I was ignorant of the fact that a man had died there, victim of a poison I prepared with my own hands. Several men stood near the entry of the house. As I approached the front step, I began to overhear fragments of their hushed, hurried conversation. He's in the drawing room. Came straight away. Image on the vial matches the maid's wax impression, an identical match. My skin felt suddenly dewy and sweat, and one of the vials slipped deeper into my gown. I made my way slowly up each step, remembering my purpose for coming to the Clarence estate. No matter what I might see or hear, I could not forget myself. I approached the front door. No one minded me as they continued to converse. Have been reported about other deaths, similar in nature. Repeat killer, perhaps? I stumbled, one foot tripping over the other, and I began to fall. 2 arms reached out to catch me, and a constable with a scar on his cheek lifted me back into a standing position. "Lady Clarence," I gasped. "I have come to speak with her," he frowned. "And for what purpose?" I paused, my mind cluttered with a mess of herbs and names and dates, like a page from Nella's register. Repeat killer. The words echoed in my mind as though someone whispered them to me. A bright light flashed behind my eye, and I felt fear that I might collapse on the floor, but the man continued to hold me. "Maid," I stammered. "I am here to speak with her about a vacancy for a housemaid." The man tilted his head, still frowning. "The lady's maid left only yesterday. Has Lady Clarence already posted a vacancy?" He then turned to look behind him, as though wanting to ask it directly of the mistress. "Come with me," he said. "She's in the parlor." We went in together, the constable leading me through the crowded foyer, smelling of sweet and sour breath. Several more officers stood in a circle, discussing what appeared to be a drawing in a newspaper, but I could not make out the image. Above a side table, lacquered in black and gold paint, an enormous mirror reflected the horror in my eyes. I turned my face away, wanting badly to escape this place of angry, red-faced men. I shouldn't have come at all. Lady Clarence sat in the parlor with a pair of constables. The moment she recognized me, she stood and let out a great breath of relief. "Oh, heavens," she said. "Have you come about the vacancy? Come, let's discuss it." And one of the constables raised his hand. "Lady Clarence, we are not finished." "I won't be but a few minutes with the child, sir." She gave him not another word before wrapping her arms around me and rushing me from the room. Her skin felt damp and sticky. Sweat beaded above her brow. Quickly she pulled me up the stairs to the 2nd story and took me into one of the rooms. It was pristinely arranged, the 4-poster bed stiff as if it was never used. A cabinet, recently polished, reflected the buttercream light from the window. "It's all very bad, Eliza," she whispered after she had shut the door. "You must go back to Nella immediately and tell her to leave, both of you as soon as possible, for she will be arrested and hanged, and you too, possibly. They will not spare you on account of your age. Oh, how impossible this whole thing is." "I do not understand," I said, my lips trembling, words tumbling out. "You returned the jar, and you said all was well." "Oh, but it fell all apart last evening. You see, when my maid left yesterday, little did I know that she first divulged much to the constables. She told them I instructed her to put the contents of the jar in the glass, and she gave them the wax rubbing of the jar. It shows the little bit of bear and the address. The address, thank heavens, has not been discerned, though I fear it was only a matter of time, and little use in returning the jar to Nella when the maid had already made the impression of it, isn't it? How terrible that maid is! How cowardly! If she had any smart, she would have stole the jar itself and given it to the police. But I suppose she was scared enough someone might walk in and catch her stuffing it into her gown. Lady Clarence sat on the bed and smoothed her skirts. The image was printed overnight in a bulletin and put onto the papers this morning, and shortly thereafter a gentleman from St. John's Square went straight to the authorities. Several weeks ago, following the unexpected death of his grown son, which they first believed to be jail fever, he found a vial underneath the bed where his son had died. He thought nothing of the vial at the time, until seeing the image in the newspaper. The exact image of the bear was on the vial he found. Lady Clarence paused to breathe, looking helplessly at the window. No address was on the man's vial, thank heavens. I know little more than this, Eliza, but I have heard whispers between the officers that there is another person, perhaps two, who came forward with something similar. Look-alike containers they discovered with the same little bear etching, and each of them had an account of an unexpected death among their close circle. Who knows how many there will be, but now there is talk of a repeat killer, a great rush to identify the address. They have deciphered a couple of the letters, so it is only a matter of time before they muster the map makers and trace every street. She ran her hand over the top of the dresser next to us, which was spotless until her fingers left an oily smear. This matters greatly to me, of course, she said, lowering her voice even further. Late last evening, the bailiff confronted me about my maid's claim that I'd killed my husband, and what could I do except deny it? So now, that address is still even more important to the authorities, as they intend to speak to the dispenser of the jar as to who purchased it. And I am so glad you came, for how could I escape such prying eyes to tell Nella of this? Would she give them my name? Oh, go now and convince her otherwise. Tell her she must leave in an instant. Otherwise they will find her and employ whatever tricks they have until she gives up her secrets. Lady Clarence shivered and wrapped her arms around herself. And to think I threatened to reveal her after she threw the powder into the fire. My God, how it has all turned against me. Go now, or we will find ropes around our necks by nightfall. Of further questions, I had none. I did not care to know more about the man in the drawing room with the matching vial, or where the deceiving lady's maid had run off to, or whether the poor Lord Clarence had even been laid to rest in the ground yet. I knew all there was to know, and it was more than Mr. Amwell's spirit that haunted me now. The shadow of my mistake, which I thought removed only hours ago, had now returned with a vengeance. I must make haste to Nella's at once. Except, what time is it? I asked. The tincture to remove bad fortune was, now more than ever, the utmost importance. Nothing else could save Nella and me from this predicament. Lady Clarence gave me a surprised look. There is a clock in the corridor, she said, but as we made our way out of the room, I exhaled frustration. The clock said it was not even 1:30. Only 28 minutes has passed since I stoppered the vial. Out of the house I ran, pushing past the many uniformed men mulling around the foyer. Several of them watched as I left, and I overheard Lady Clarence tell them she turned me away for the vacancy. I dared not look behind me until I made it to Dean's Court, and I was greatly relieved to see that no one had followed me. To be very sure, I took a complicated, winding route back to the shop. When I reached 3 Back Alley, I shoved open the storeroom door, and I did not even give Nella a courtesy knock on the hidden wall of shelves. Instead, I reached for the hidden lever, slid the door open. Nella stood at the table, her register in front of her. She had turned it towards the middle. Her body was bent over the table, as though she meant to read one of the entries from a long time ago. At my abrupt entrance, she looked up at me. "Nella, we must leave," I cried. "Something terrible has happened. Lady Clarence's maid. She told the authorities that—" "You saw the paper?" Nella interrupted, her voice so thick that I wondered if she hadn't taken a heavy dose of laudanum. "The maid gave them the wax rubbing. I know all about it." I stared back at her, stunned. She already knew of it? Why had she not left? I looked at the clock by the door. 37 minutes had passed. I rushed forward to the shelf above the table, the contents of which I now was familiar, and I pulled down the jar with the tear-shaped drops, resin of frankincense. I had seen Nella take them once before, after rubbing her swollen fingers. "There is more," I said. "Take some of these while I tell you." I explained that I passed by Lady Clarence's home and heard it all from the mistress herself. After the papers were printed, another person, perhaps 2 or 3 or more, came forward with vials that were engraved with the same bear. All the vials were found in the days or weeks following untimely deaths, and now authorities believe the vials might be associated with a repeat killer. "I had not heard that," Nella said, her face calm. Had she gone mad? Did she not understand the urgency and what this all meant? Only moments ago, she was the one telling me to make haste. Why did she not do it herself? "Nella, listen to me," I pleaded. "You cannot stay. Remember the night you helped me with the beetles? Somehow you drew together your strength. Do it now, please." Then I was struck with an idea. "We can go to the Amwells until we determine what to do next. It is the perfect place. No one will bother us there." So long as Nella was with me, I felt I could stand inside the house while waiting for the tincture to finish curing. Mr. Amwell's spirit would not harm me with her close, would it? "Easy, child," Nella replied, putting a handful of resin pills in her mouth. "I do not intend to stay here." She pushed the jar of frankincense aside. "I know where I'm going. I was about to leave anyhow. But you mustn't come with me. I will go alone." If my agreement was what she needed, she had it. I smiled at her and helped her with her coat. As I did so, I was reminded of the first time I visited the shop, only a week before. How much had happened in the recent days, and none of it good. I remembered sitting at the chair across from her, hesitant to drink the valerian hot brew, while Mr. Amwell, Lord Clarence were still alive, and ignorant of the plans laid out before them. I remembered, too, my second visit, pleased with the success of the poisoned eggs, but plagued with the new terror, and crouching forward in pain as my belly bled. At once a memory struck me. "Nella, after we harvested the beetles, and you told me about Frederick, you said that if you'd bled again, you might have stopped this long ago." Nella looked sharply away, as though my question just had struck her on the side of the face. "Yes," she said between clenched teeth, "perhaps I would have, but you are too young to understand what I mean, so you may forget I said it at all." "When will I be old enough to understand?" "There is no set age," she said, checking the bottom of her coat. "When your womb is ready to carry a baby, you will begin to bleed once each month as the moon makes her route across the sky. It is a passage, child, into maturity." I frowned. "As the moon makes her route across the sky." Didn't Mrs. Amwell say something similar on the night it began to bleed, the night we killed her husband? "How long does the bleeding last?" I asked. Nella looked at me strangely. Her eyes narrowed, as though reconsidering me. 3 or 4 days, sometimes more. She lowered her voice. "Did your mother or Mrs. Amwell never tell you of this?" I shook my head. "Are you bleeding now, child?" she asked. Suddenly embarrassed, I said, "No, but I did a few days ago." It hurt very much. My belly felt swollen and cramped. "And it was the first time?" I nodded. "It happened right after Mr. Amwell's death. I feared he did it to me." Nella raised a hand and smiled softly. "A mere coincidence, child. You are blessed, and more than me. I only wish you told me sooner. I could have mixed something to ease the cramping altogether." I wished I'd told her sooner, too. For the first time since the death of Mr. Amwell, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that the bleeding might not have been his wicked spirit taking hold of me. Could it have been simply the monthly bleeding of which Nella just spoke, a passage into maturity? I had never thought of myself as a woman, only a child, a girl. I wished to think on it longer, but there was no time. We should have left long ago. Nella's register was still open on the table, and I glanced down at it. She had opened it to the year 1770, more than 20 years ago. The page was badly damaged. A dark red stain, like wine, smeared across the side. Why had Nella returned to this old entry? Perhaps to turn back the pages of her life, to remember the early days, before it all began. When this page was written, Nella's heart was not yet scarred. Her joints were not yet swollen and stiff. Motherhood, and her own mother, had not yet been taken from her. Perhaps she revisited the entry because she meant to remember these things, the honorable work she once did, the sort of apothecary she could have been, the virtuous woman her mother wanted her to be. All of it thrown aside in the bitter wake of Frederick's betrayal. Nella caught me looking, then closed the book with a loud snap and led us to the door to go on our separate ways. Nella, February 11th, 1791. If the departure from my shop was to be a temporary one, I would have reached into the cabinets, beginning with my mother's, along the side wall, to withdraw certain sentimental items I wanted for keepsake. But death was permanent. What earthly objects, then, would I need? I could not tell this to Eliza. Of course, after she helped me with my coat, my strength mercifully had returned for the moment on account of the frankincense. We stood together at the threshold, ready to leave, and I was forced to give appearance that I would be back to this place after the crisis had passed. My eyes fell on the line that Eliza had drawn in the soot on her first visit, and the clean, embellished stone hiding underneath the filth. My breath caught. From the moment she arrived, this child unwittingly began to unravel me, to expose something inside of me. Is there nothing you want to take? Your books? She pointed at the register on the center of the table, the one I had just slammed shut. Contained within were the thousands of remedies I had dispensed over the years, harmless draughts of lavender alongside deadly arsenic-laced puddings. But more important were the names of the women recorded inside. I could open the book to any page and easily recall the memories of the women within, no matter their ailments, betrayals, or boils. The book was evidence of my life, the people I had helped and the people I had hurt, and with what tincture or plaster or draught, and how much and when, on an account of who. It would be wise of me to take it, so the secrets could sink with me to the bottom of the Thames. The words smeared, the pages dissolved, the truth of this place destroyed. In this way, I could protect the women within the register. Yet to protect them was to erase them. These women were not queens and great heiresses. Rather, they were middling women whose names would not be found in gilded lineage charts. My mother's legacy embodied the brewing of potions to ease maladies, but it also meant preserving the memories of these women in the register, granting them their single mark on the world. No, I would not do it. I would not erase these women, obliterate them as easily as I'd done the first batch of Canthride's powder. History might dismiss these women, but I would not. No, I said at last, the book will be safe here. They will not find this place, child. No one will find this place. A few minutes later, we stood in the storage room. The hidden door to my shop was closed, and the lever latched. I placed my hand on top of Eliza's head, her hair soft and warm against my fingers. I was grateful that the frankincense has numbed more than just my bones, for my innermost turmoil had also been tempered. I was not breathless or forlorn, nor did I await the rushing water with any sense of dread. I considered it fitting that in the final moments of my life, I was aided by one of the many vials of my shelf. In my life and in my death, I relied on the palliative nature of what was inside those glass bottles, and I was reminded then of more good memories than bad, more births than murder, more blood of life than of death. But it was not only the frankincense that gave me comfort in this decisive moment. It was also the comfort of little Eliza. Despite the fact of her error had brought all this upon me, I chose not to harbor ill feelings towards her, and instead I regretted the only day that Lady Clarence left me the letter. Indeed, if it wasn't for her and her scheming lady's maid, I would not be in the predicament I found myself in now. Yet there was no use in looking back. In the face of this hard goodbye, and very soon my own departure from life, Eliza's inquisitive spirit and youthful energy were salves upon my heart. I never met my own daughter, but I suspect she would have been much like the girl standing next to me. I put my arm around Eliza's shoulder and pulled her close to me. With a final glance behind us, I led Eliza out of the storage room door. We stepped into the alley. The cold air wrapped around us, and I began to walk. Up here, I motioned, to where Bear Alley opened up to the avenue. You will continue on to the Amwell House, or wherever you choose to go, and I will go my way. In the corner of my vision, Eliza nodded. I moved closer to her, in a final, visible goodbye. We did not make it but 20 steps before I saw them. 3 constables, wearing dark blue coats, walking straight up to us, their faces grim. One of them carried a rod in his hand, as though the shadow of the alley scared him, and I could faintly make out a scar across his cheek. Eliza must have seen the men at the same time, for, without speaking a word or exchanging a glance, we began to run. Together, we instinctively headed south towards the river, away from them, our sharp breaths harmony with each other. Eliza, February 11th, 1791. My legs began to burn soon after leaving the alley, and my left foot started to blister, the swollen skin rubbing against my worn shoes with each stride. I gasped for air, and a sharp pain, like an ice pick, left me clutching my rib. Everything in my body began to say, "Stop, stop." The constables were 20 strides from us now, perhaps less. How had they found us? Had they followed me from Lady Clarence's estate, even though I took a winding, complicated route? There were only 2 of them. The 3rd constable must have stayed behind, or perhaps he could not keep up. They chased after us, this pair of wolves, like we were rabbits. Their supper. Where was the wolf's bane now? But we stayed ahead of them. We did not carry things of iron on our uniforms, or have stomachs heavy with ale. And even in her weakened state, Nella was faster than the constables. As they pursued us, the distance grew greater by 3, 5, 6 strides. With instinct of prey, I motioned for Ella to follow me, and I made a sharp left turn into a small alley. We raced to the very back, the constables having not yet come around the corner to see where we had gone, and found ourselves at a cobbled walking path leading to another alley. I grabbed Nella's hand and pulled her forward. She winced at some pain, but I ignored it. There was no room for pity in my fear-stricken heart. I wanted desperately to look behind us, to see if the constables had turned onto the alley and were quick on our heels, but I resisted. A stinging sensation crawled across my collarbone. Not slowing my steps, I glanced down, expecting to see a bee or some other biting insect. Instead, it was one of the vials pressing uncomfortably against my skin as I ran, as if I needed a reminder that the minutes were passing too slowly, and it was not yet time for the tincture. Ahead, situated behind a carriage house, I spotted a stable, dark, covered with several haystacks, forming a boulder that stood twice as tall as me. I aimed straight for it, still urging Nella along, but her grimace told me that she was in real pain. Her face, which a moment ago was a beating, angry red, had now gone pale. Nella and I passed the carriage house and slithered through a wooden gate leading to the stables. There was a horse in the center stall, and he exhaled nervously at our approach, as though sensing danger. We made our way to the stall at the far end, halfway hidden by the carriage house. Here at last, Nella and I crumbled to the ground, which was covered mostly in the remains of loose hay. It felt like being back in Swindon again, inside the stables where I used to fall asleep instead of doing my chores. I avoided a spot towards the center with a pile of horse dung, but Nella paid no attention to where she sat. "Are you well?" I asked between my own desperate breaths. She nodded her head weakly. Crouching down to seek out an opening in the wall where I could peek out, I found a penny-sized hole so close to the ground that I had to kick aside a pile of soiled hay and lie on my belly. Peering through the hole, I was relieved to see nothing awry. No officers searched the area, no dogs sniffing the scent of a newcomer. There was not much but a stable attendant doing chores. But I was not so naive to believe we were out of harm's way, so I held my position on the damp ground. For the next few minutes, I altered between deeply inhaling in order to catch. For the next few minutes, I alternated between deeply inhaling in order to catch my breath, checking the peephole for any movement outside, and glancing at Nella, who remained very still and had not spoken a word since we left the shop. As I lay there, watching her slowing breath and the way she brushed an unruly curl from her face, I remember the very night we slept in another stable after beetle hunting. That was the night that Nella had revealed so much to me, her love for Frederick, his betrayal of her, and everything that led her to live a life as a prisoner of brothers, husbands, masters, sons. Peeking out again, movement caught my eye. Given the tiny hole through which I looked, I tried to move my eye around the narrow field of vision, to no avail. I waited, my heart thundering in my chest. "They may find us in here yet, Eliza," came a hoarse whisper behind me. I winced at the strain in Nella's voice. "If they do, you must deny knowing me. You must deny ever setting foot into my shop. Do you understand? This is not yours to face. Say that I threatened you, forced you into the stables, and—" "Shh!" I hushed her. My God, she looked weak. The resin drops were fading fast. And ahead, near the carriage house, a small gathering has formed. I could not make out everyone in attendance, but several young men chatted animately and waved their hands, pointing around the edge of the stables, where we now waited with bated breath. Given my position on my belly, my arms bore most of my weight and began to shake, but I could not release the weight without also pulling my eye from the people. If the men searched the stables, they would find us within seconds. I looked to the back of the stables. The walls were roughly 1.5 meters high, and I felt confident that I could scale it and escape from the back if necessary. Though a touch of color had returned to her face, I was not so confident about Nella. I could escape now if I wanted to leave her and be caught alone, but I brought her into this, and I must now try to fix my wrongdoings. "Nella," I said to her, my voice a mere whisper. "We must escape over the back wall there. Do you have the strength?" Without answering, she began to lift herself from the ground. "Wait," I said. "Stay low. There are people just by the carriage house." She must not have heard me, for she began to crawl up the wall. Before I could stop her, she lifted herself up and over and collapsed on the other side. Then she began to run as best she could. I heard a man yell from behind us, and I was at once furious with Nella for her recklessness, which had drawn the attention of these men. Without looking behind me, I scaled the wall easily, landed on 2 feet, and ran after Nella, who was already several strides ahead of me. She hurried south down the short pathway between the 2 houses, limping all the while, and ahead I saw the cool, glimmering, dark River Thames. She was heading straight for it. Unlike a few moments ago when I pulled her along, there seemed now a renewed strength in Nella, some primal fear, and it was me who followed her. The river drew closer and closer, and when she turned onto Water Street, I believed her to be making her way to Blackfriar Bridge. "No," I yelled at her, as she skidded the shadowy edge of a building. "We will be in clear view." I had not the breath to explain my logic, but with these men a short distance behind us, I knew that our chances of escape were best if we remained hidden by the shadows of the alley. Perhaps we could find an unlocked door to run into. London was big enough to aid many a criminal in escape, as Nella well knew from a lifetime of secrecy. "Nella," I said, a cramp suddenly seizing my side. "It is too open, like being on stage." Ignoring me, she drew nearer Blackfriar Bridge, which swarmed with children, families, and couples, walking hand in hand. Had Nella lost her mind altogether? Surely some bold man would see the constables chasing us and take it upon himself to stop us, overpowering us with his strength. Had Nella thought of none of this? She kept running, not looking back. Where was it that she meant to go? What was it that she meant to do? Near the center of the bridge, a clock tower seized my attention. I squinted, looking at the tip of the small hand. It was 10 minutes after 2. 70 minutes. Enough time had passed. The tincture was ready. I turned my head back to see that indeed the officers had followed us onto the bridge. I reached into my bodice of my gown, my fingers wrapped around the 2 smooth vials near my breast. I'd prepared 2 vials in case one slipped from my dress, but I realized this decision had been wise for another reason. Both Nella and I found ourselves in a desperate situation. In my effort to carefully remove the first vial from my gown, I failed to notice that Nella had come to a complete stop in the middle of the bridge, chest heaving, her hands on the railing. I slowed now just inches behind her. Dozens of people dressed in black and gray moved all around us, unaware. Capture was imminent. I gave the officers 15, maybe 20 seconds before they were upon us. I uncorked the blue vial first. "Take this," I pleaded, handing it to Nella. "It will fix everything." I wished for the spell to give her wise words to say to the constable for all the lies on her tongue. Any kind of powerful magic, like that which had brought breath back to Tom Pepper's lungs when he was an infant. Nella looked to see what was in my hand. At seeing the vial, she showed no surprise. Perhaps she suspected I hadn't really been making hot brews when she went off to the market. Perhaps she knew all along that they were a disguise. Her shoulders trembling violently. "We must part now," she said. "Go into the crowd, little Eliza, and disappear, like you're one of them. Run," she breathed, "and let the men follow me into the river." Into the river? All this time I had wondered why she made her way straight to the Thames. But how could I have not seen it? I understand now exactly what she meant to do. The constables grew nearer, fighting against the mass of people around them. pushing them aside. One of the men was close, only seconds from us. I could see the chapped skin on his lips and the angry scar on his left cheek, which I recognized instantly. He was one of the constables I had seen at Lady Clarence's. He pushed towards us, staring directly at me, and the look of vengeance in his eyes said, "This is where it ends." Nella, February 11th, 1791. Eliza and I stood together on the bridge, the constable no more than 3 strides behind us. Death was close, so close that I could feel the chill of its outstretched arms. The seconds preceding my death were not as I expected. Within me there arose no memories of my mother, my lost child, or even Frederick. There was only one memory, a single young one, hardly formed, little Eliza, and the first time she appeared at my doorstep, in her threadbare cloak, her poor excuse of a hat, yet her cheeks so young and dewy, like a newborn. In the truest sense of the word, she was a disguise, the perfect murderer, for many a servant had murdered her master in the city of London, but who would believe this 12-year-old served poison-laced eggs at the breakfast table? No one would believe it, not even me, and so it was that I fell into disbelief again, for as we stood on the bridge together, and I prepared to jump, just as the word "run" had tumbled off my tongue, the girl lifted her thin legs over the railing of Blackfriar Bridge. She looked back at me with a gentle gaze, the edge of her skirt whipping up in the breeze that pushed up against her from the River Thames. Was this a trick, or was my eyes deceiving me, perhaps under attack by the demon inside me, ravaging me of this vulnerable sense in my final moments? I heaved my weight forward to grab her, but she slid away from me along the railing, my efforts no match for her nimble movements. This left me furious, as her little game had taken precious seconds from me. However, I must find the strength to lift my own bones over the metal railing before the officer sees me. One hand on the railing, Eliza's other hand clutched the tiny blue vial that she had just offered me. She lifted it to her lips, sucked the liquid from it like a starving infant, and tossed it into the water below. "It will save me," she whispered. Then her fingers, one by one, slid from the railing like ribbons. Everything placed onto the body removes something from it, calls it forth, or represses it. My mother taught me this simple lesson, the power of earth-born remedies, when I was a child. They were the words of the great philosopher Aulus, of whom little was known. Some, in fact, doubted his existence, much less the veracity of his claim. His words flooded over me as I watched Eliza's body fall. I had never before experienced the strangeness of this vantage point, to watch someone fall directly below me. Her hair pulled upwards as though I had an invisible hold on it. Her arms crossed over her chest, as though she had something to protect inside. She looked directly ahead, her gaze on the river outstretched before her. I clung to the promise of Aulus's words. I knew that, placed upon the body, oils and tinctures and draughts could remove, indeed, unweave and destroy, the creations of one's womb. They could remove the things once most desired. I knew, too, that they could call forth pain and hatred and revenge. They could call forth evil inside oneself, and rotting of bones, and splitting of joints. Yet placed upon the body, these things could repress what? Could they repress death? By the time my fearful, racing heart understood what had happened, Eliza had disappeared into the water, the death I have dreamed of as my own. But animal instinct begged me away to the more urgent crisis before me. The constable's mere inches away, his arms reaching as though he, too, wanted to grab hold of the falling girl, for by jumping from the bridge she had implicated herself, and the constable must have surely believed that only she could solve the mystery of who slipped the poison into the liquor that killed Lord Clarence. All around us, movement. A distraught-looking woman carrying a basket of oysters, a man herding a small flock of sheep south, several young children scattered about like rats. They all closed in, dressed in dark, morbidly curious. The constable turned his gaze on me. "Were you in on it together?" He motioned to the water. I could not respond, so shattered was my still-beating heart. Below me the river toiled, as though angry with its newly claimed victim. It should not have been her. It should have been me. My desire to die was what brought us to the peak of the bridge anyhow. The constable spat at my feet. "Bloody mute, are you?" I leaned onto the railing, my knees no longer serving me, and gripped the iron. The second officer, brawnier than the first one, came up behind him, his cheeks red, his chest heaving. She jumped. He peered around in disbelief before finally turning his appraise on me. "This can't be the second one, Putman," he shouted. "She can hardly stand." The two we saw, they were dressed like everyone else. He looked over the crowd, presumably searching for another cloaked figure with more vigor in her face than me. "Damn you, though, Craw, it is!" Putman yelled back, like a fisherman about to lose a valuable catch. "She can stand fine. She's only shocked at the loss of her friend." I was indeed, and I felt as though he meant to dig the fishhook as far into my flesh as it would go. Craw stepped closer and leaned into his partner, lowering his voice. "You sure she's not just one of the crowd, then?" He motioned around him. The mob of bodies, all dressed in similar dark coats as mine, had grown around us. By mere appearance, I blended in with them. "You're sure enough to let her swing?" "The prisoner's dead, sir." He glanced over the edge of the bridge, buried in the muck by now. A flash of doubt crossed Putman's face, and Craw seized it like a drop of a coin. "We chased the rat out of her hole, and we both saw her jump. It ends here. This is enough to satisfy the papers." "And the dead Lord Clarence?" Putman screamed, his face red. He turned on me. "Do you know anything about him? Who bought the poison that killed him?" I shook my head and heaved out the words like vomit. "I don't know who that is, or any poison that killed him." A sudden commotion silenced the men as another officer ran up the bridge. I recognized him as the third constable from the alley. "There's nothing there, sirs," he said. "What the hell do you mean?" Putnam asked. I broke through the door where the women came out. Not a thing inside. A dry storage bin full of rotted grain. Amid the distress of the moment, I felt a singular sense of pride. The register and the countless names within were safe. All of those women safe. Putnam jerked his head at me. "Does this woman look familiar? Was she one of the two we saw?" The third constable hesitated. "Hard to tell, sir. We were quite the distance." Putnam nodded as though he, too, hated to finally admit to this. Craw gave him a stiff pat on the back. "Your case against this woman is losing its leg, good sir." Putnam spat at my feet. "Get out of my face, wench," he said. These three men gave a final glance over the railing, nodded at one another, and headed back down the bridge. After they had gone, I peered over the edge, my eyes searching desperately for the swirling fabric of a soaked gown or the creamy paleness of skin. But I saw nothing, only the muddied, unsettled churn of the river. She needn't have done it. Her little heart must have thought that bringing this devastation upon us, with her mistake, she must be the one to take the fall. Or perhaps it was something more, like her fear of the spirits. Perhaps she feared my spirit, haunting her after my death, cursing her for bringing this upon us. Oh, how I wished I'd been gentler with her about the ghost of Mr. Amwell. How I wish I had softened my tone, gained her trust, convinced her of what was real and what was not. I wanted more than anything to reverse time and pull her back up towards me. I stumbled backwards a step. My knees weakened under the suffocating sense of regret, but also discontent. I meant to be the one down there. I meant to be the one to die. Could I live another day bearing this new agony too? The crowd had mostly dispersed. They no longer pushed inward, curious. As if forced aside the memory of Eliza's fall, I could almost convince myself that nothing had changed. It was just me alone with the end I had always imagined. I squeezed my eyes shut and thought of all that I had lost, and then I stepped towards the railing and leaned over the hungry black waves. Nella, February 11th, 1791. Before I lifted my own leg over the railing, I paused. All that I lost. It weighed on me now, a lifetime of misery, like the raw earth pressing into an open grave. And yet, this precise moment of breath, the light breeze on the back of my neck, the distant call of some hungry waterfowl on the river, the taste of salt on my tongue, these were all things I had not lost yet. I stepped back from the railing and opened my eyes. All that I'd lost, or all that I hadn't. Eliza jumped in my place, a final offering to me, her last breath an effort to fool the authorities and implicate herself as a prisoner. How could I possibly throw her gift back into the water to sink alongside her? As I stood at the bridge and looked over the East River Thames, another person came to mind. Mrs. Amwell, Eliza's beloved mistress. She would return to her estate in the coming days, only to find Eliza gone, disappeared. No matter the pretense and feigned grief Mrs. Amwell displayed now at the loss of her husband, once she discovered Eliza missing, the grief would no longer be a ruse. It might haunt her for a lifetime, this belief that the child had abandoned her. I must tell Mrs. Amwell the truth. I must tell her that Eliza had died, and I must confront this woman the only way I knew how, a tincture which would ease the piercing ache in her heart when she learned that little Eliza would write her letters no more. And so I turned away from the railing of the bridge, willing the sob in my throat to delay until I was alone, until I was back in my shop of poisons, which I had meant never to see again. 22 hours had passed since the moment Eliza jumped, an entire night and day, during which I prepared and bottled the skullcap I meant to deliver to Amwell Estate. And yet still my hands felt the chill of the empty air as I reached for her. Still I heard the plunge of her body, the sucking of the water as it took her in. After I left the bridge and returned to 3 Back Alley, I could smell the traces of the constable in the storage room, the sweaty, filthy scent of a man sneaking about the room, looking for something he would not find. He did not find the new letter in the barley bin. It must have been left only recently, perhaps when I went to the market and Eliza busied herself with her tincture. I held the letter now in my hands. No scent of lavender or rose wafted up from the paper. The hand was not particularly fine or neat. The woman had little detail, identifying herself only as a housewife betrayed by her husband. This final request, hardly different than the first. The preparation would be uncomplicated. Indeed, a glass bottle of prussic acid sat within my arm's reach. I could dispense it with minimal effort in less than a minute's time, and perhaps this final poison, this last one, would finally grant me the peace I'd sought since my baby fell from my belly at the hands of Frederick, healing by way of vengeance. But no such thing existed. It never had. Hurting others had only injured me further. I took the letter, traced the words with my finger, and stood from my chair. Bending forward, I stretched one weak leg in front of the other, my breath raspy, and I approached the hearth. A low flame ate away at a single scrap of wood. Gently, I set the letter into the dancing peak of the light, watching as the paper ignited in an instant. No, I would not grant this woman what she wanted. No more death would go forth from this room. And with that, my shop of poison existed no longer. The single flame in the hearth sputtered out. The final letter crumbled to ash. No balms left to simmer. No tonics left to blend. No tinctures to mix. No plants to uproot. I leaned forward and began to cough, a clot of blood making its way out of my lungs and onto my tongue. I'd been coughing up blood since yesterday afternoon, since running from the bailiffs, falling over the back wall of the horse stable, and watching my young friend fall to her death. I expended a year's worth of effort in mere minutes. The bailiffs, by way of chase, dove me closer to death than I had realized. I spit the blood clot into the ash, without even a desire to take a drink of water and wash the sticky residue from my tongue. I felt no thirst, no hunger, and I had not urinated in nearly a day. I knew this did not bode well. When the throat ceased to beg, when the bladder ceases to fill, it is nearly over. I knew this because I had experienced it. I had helped it happen once before. The day my mother died, I knew I must go to the Amwell estate, and soon. I would leave the letter and the tincture with the servant, for Eliza said the mistress may be gone some weeks, and I did not expect her to be in. Then I would go to the river, sit along its silent bank, and wait for a certain death. I did not expect the wait to be long, but before I left my shop for good, a single task remained. I lifted my quill, pulled open the register towards me, and diligently began to record my final entry. Though I did not dispose the potion, and I knew not what ingredients it contained, I could not leave without confessing the life of her, the loss of her. Eliza Fanning, London, birth unknown, February 12, 1791. As the nib scratched along the paper, my hand shook terribly, as the words were so sullied that the handwriting appeared not even my own. Indeed, it was as though some unknown spirit refused to let me write the words, refused to let me record the death of little Eliza. As I approached the Amwell estate, my vision began to twist and spin, colors bright like a child's toy, the city of London unsteady around me. I tucked the bloodied rag in my pocket of my skirts and looked at the faces walking past, some sharp with concern about the dried blood on my lips, others hazy and obscure and unseen, as though I did not exist at all. I wondered if I entered a realm of ghosts. Was there such things as a half-world, an in-between place where the dead and the living mingled together? In another pocket of my skirt was the package, the skullcap tincture, and a short letter in which I explained to Mrs. Amwell that Eliza would not be returning, and not for a lack of affection, but because of a heroic act in which Eliza was selfless and brave. I also advised the mistress of the suggested dosage of the skullcap tea, just as I did when she came to my shop long ago, seeking a remedy for her trembling hands. I would have written more. Oh, how much I could have written, but time did not permit, as indicated by the smudge of blood on the corner of the paper. I hadn't even had time to record the skullcap on my last remedy in my register. The estate loomed ahead, 3 stories of muddled, blood-red brick. Sash windows, 12 panes each, or maybe 16. I could not be sure of anything, not in these final minutes. It was all so hazy. I urged my feet forward. I must only reach the front steps, the black door, and set down the package. I glanced up at the gabled roof, tilting and bending beneath the clouds. No smoke bled from the chimney. As suspected, the mistress was not home. This came as a great relief. I had not the strength to talk to her. I would drop the package and go, crawl away south to the nearest set of riverbed stairs, if I could manage to make it so far. A child scurried by, laughing, nearly tangling herself in my skirts. She spun about me once, twice, playing a game of my senses, reminding me of the baby that fell from my belly. She ran off as quickly as she appeared, my vision blurred with tears. Her face seemed to melt away. I began to feel a fool for doubting Eliza's claim that ghosts reside all around her. Perhaps I'd been wrong when I told her these spirits were only remnants of her memories, creations of an invigorated imagination. The package. I must drop the package. A final glance upward to the dormer window where the servants must be. I hoped one would see me drop the paper-wrapped bundle at the porch just steps ahead, then retrieve it for safekeeping until Mrs. Amwell returned. Indeed, yes, a servant spotted me. I saw her clear as day behind the window, with her thick black hair and her chin held high. I stopped short on the walkway, my fingers loosening on the package. With a soft thunk, it fell to the ground. This was no servant behind the window. It was an apparition, my little Eliza. I could not move. I could not breathe. But then a flash, a movement. As the shadow pulled away from the window, I fell to my knees, the urge to cough rising within me, the color of London turning black, everything turning black, my last breath only seconds away, and then in my final coherent moment, the color around me returning. Little Eliza with the bright youthful eyes I knew so well, floating out of the house in my direction, a rosy flash of glass. I frowned, trying to focus my vision. Clutched in her hands was a tiny vial, similar in size and shape to the one she'd offered me at the bridge. Only the vial had been blue, and this one was seashell pink. She uncorked it, and she ran towards me. I reached for her bright shadow, finding it all so strange and unexpected, the flush in her cheeks, the inquisitive grin, as though this was not a ghost at all. Everything about her, so lifelike, everything about her, just as I remembered the moments before her death. Caroline, present day. The whole day lay empty in front of me, and I expected to be here a long while. I settled into my chair, pulled one leg up underneath me, and opened my notebook. Who is Eliza Fanning? It was one of the questions, the only question I jotted down 2 nights ago. In the search bar for the British Newspaper Archive, I typed 2 words, Eliza Fanning, then hit enter. Immediately, the search results returned a handful of entries. I scanned them quickly, but only a single record, the one at the very top of the page, appeared to be a match. I opened the article, and since it had been digitalized, the full text displayed in an instant. The article was published in the summer of 1802 by a newspaper called the Brighton Press. I opened another tab in the browser to search for Brighton, learning that it was a seaside city in England's south coast, a couple of hours away from London. The headline read, Eliza Pepper, sole inheritor of husband's magic bookshop. The article went on to say that the 22-year-old Eliza Pepper, born in Swindon, but a resident of the outskirts of Brighton since 1791, had inherited the entirety of her husband Tom Pepper's estate, including his wildly successful bookshop at the north end of the town. The shop carried a wide assortment of books on magic and the occult, and customers hailed regularly from all parts of the continent seeking remedies and cures for the most unusual of ailments. According to the article, unfortunately, Mr. Tom Pepper himself could not seem to conjure an antidote for his own troubles. He'd recently fallen ill, believed to be the pleurisy of his chest. His wife, Eliza, was his sole caregiver until he met his untimely death. But as tribute to the life and success of Mr. Pepper, a celebration was held at the shop. Hundreds were in attendance to pay their respects. After the event, a small group of reporters interviewed Mrs. Pepper about her intent for the shop, going forward. She assured the men it would remain open. "Both Tom and I owe our very lives to the magic arts," she told the reporters, before explaining that long ago in London, her very own magic blend saved her life. "I was only a child. It was my first tincture, but I risked my life for a special friend, one who still encourages and counsels me to this very day." Mrs. Pepper then added, "Maybe my youth was to blame, but I had not an ounce of fear when the moment of death presented itself. Indeed, I found the little blue vial of magic to be feverish against my skin, and after swallowing the tincture, the heat of it was so powerful that the frigid depths were a welcome respite." The article stated that the reporters questioned her further about this last bit. "The frigid depths? Do explain, Mrs. Pepper," one of the men asked, but Eliza only thanked the men for their time and insisted she was needed back inside. She then reached her arm out on either side of her, taking the hands of her 2 young children, a boy and a girl, twins, aged 4, and disappeared with them into her late husband's store, the Blackfriars shop of magic, books, and baubles. I left the British Library less than an hour after I arrived. The afternoon sun shined hot and bright above me. I bought a bottle of water from a street vendor and settled on a bench in the shade under an elm tree, considering how best to spend the rest of my day. I intended to spend the entire afternoon at the library, but I'd found what I was looking for in almost no time at all. I understood now that the apothecary was not the one who jumped from the bridge. It was her young friend Eliza Fanning. This explained how the apothecary made an entry in the register on the 12th of February. It was because, contrary to what police believed, the apothecary was not dead, but neither was Eliza. Whether on account of her tincture or her sheer luck, the girl survived the fall. But the article about Eliza didn't explain everything. It didn't explain why the ingredients of the tincture were unknown to the apothecary, or whether the police ever knew of Eliza's existence. The article didn't state whether the apothecary subscribed to Eliza's same belief about the effects of magic, nor did it explain the nature of Eliza's relationship with the apothecary. And still, I did not know the apothecary's name. There was something poignant, too, about young Eliza's involvement. Shrouded in mystery was the role she played in the apothecary's life and death. She'd only revealed to the papers that she risked her life for a special friend, one who still counseled her to this day. Did this mean the apothecary lived another decade and had left London to join Eliza in Brighton? Or had Eliza been referring to something else, the apothecary's ghost, perhaps? I would never know. Perhaps I would glean more information about these missing details someday. But I knew there was something else I needed to do today. I took the underground from the library to Blackfriars Station. As I exited the train, I headed east towards Millennium Bridge, strolling along the narrow riverfront walkway. The river, to my right, rolled calmly along its well-worn path. I followed along the knee-high stone wall for some time. Then I spotted the concrete steps leading to the river. They were the same steps I'd taken a few days earlier, just before the mudlarking tour. I made my way down the steps, then stepped carefully over the smooth, rounded stones along the river. The silence struck me, as it did the first time I was here. I was grateful to see that there were no people milling around the rocks, no sightseers, no children, and no groups. Opening my bag, I pulled out the light blue vial, the one I knew which had contained Eliza's magic tincture. It had rescued her, and in some strange way, it had done the same for me. According to the apothecary's register, the contents of this vial 200 years ago, the ingredients had been unknown. The unknown had been an unpleasant concept to me, but I realized now the opportunity in it, the excitement in it. Clearly, it had been the same for Eliza. For both of us, the vial marked the end of one quest and the beginning of another. It represented a crossroads, the abandonment of secrets and pain in favor of embracing the truth, in favor of embracing magic. Magic with its enchanting, irresistible appeal, just like a fairy tale. The vial looked exactly as it had when I found it, I'll bet a bit cleaner and smudged with my own fingerprints. I traced the bear with my thumbnail, thinking of all the vial had taught me, that the hardest truths never rest on the surface. They must be dredged out, held to the light, and rinsed clean. A movement in my peripheral vision caught my attention. A pair of women upriver a long way, walking towards me. They must have come down another set of steps. I paid them no mind as I prepared for my final task. I clutched the vial to my chest. Eliza must have done the same while standing on Blackfriar Bridge, not so far from here. Raising the vial above my head, I thrust it forward into the water with as much strength as I had. I watched the bottle make an arch upward and over the water, and then splash gently into the far depths of the Thames. A single ripple made its way upward before a low wave overtook it. Eliza's vial, my vial, our vial. The truth of it remains the one secret I would not share. As I stepped onto the concrete steps to make my way upwards and out of the riverbed, I glanced once more upriver towards the two women. The stretch of river was long and straight. They should have been closer to me by now. But I frowned and studied the area, and then smiled at my own wild imagination. My eyes must have been playing tricks with me, for the two women were nowhere to be found.